Dietmar Pichler is passionate about building resilience against disinformation and propaganda. He's dedicated to protecting democracy from autocratic regimes and extremist groups and their narratives. Russian propaganda is the elephant in the room, he says, that we need to address when discussing media literacy and to creating more resilient societies to fight against informational aggression. Dietmar, welcome to the channel.
Thank you very much. I'm glad to be here.
Well, I've been following your comments on Twitter for a long time because one, they're incredibly forceful, but also they're incredibly well structured and thought out. And you really seek to take apart disinformation narratives and, list them all out. Incredibly comprehensive materials. And of course, you comment on current topics in order to identify the disinformation narratives that percolate through into them. And unfortunately, there are many, many instances of those. We won't have time in this conversation to discuss them all. But what is your motivation for becoming a specialist in this area?
Yeah, well, thank you for this question. My history regarding disinformation in the working sphere started actually because I was a public health communicator. So I thought about anti-vaxxers and before it was cool. And about social media and about conspiracy theories. And personally, in after 9/11, conspiracy theories and anti-Americanism, I saw it all on news groups, on communities online. It was not called social media back then. There was no Web 2.0 revolution yet, but it was already widespread. And I saw things in the internet that I heard only from drunk people before. Yeah. So what you hear in a bar, you can hear it online. You can spread it. It looks professional. It looks like published. Yeah. The written words, they have a different impact. Yeah, so this was kind of my initiate approach to this. And after 2013, when the Euromaidan revolution started in Ukraine, I was there. I was myself there in 2013 and in 2014 because I wanted to become a journalist for Eastern European affairs. Unfortunately, it never happened because this magazine that wanted to hire me went bankrupt. But I got already hooked on Eastern Europe and all the countries that were formerly occupied by Moscow. I try to avoid to say were formerly Soviet, part of the Soviet Union, because the people don't like this description. And yeah, well, when I came back from the Euromaidan revolution, I couldn't believe my ears, what I heard, and my eyes, what I was reading in the German-speaking media space, but also internationally. So many conspiracy theories, even my colleagues, my friends, my peers, and I told them I tried to debunk it personally, and it was not that easy. Even if I was there myself, if I had already many Ukrainian friends and contacts, and so I wanted to go deeper. And after the annexation of Crimea happened the Russian hidden invasion of Donbass. And this is for me the most of the important topics because when it happened, even myself, I knew Ukraine well. I didn't know how many people actually supported Russia there. And the more I dig deeper into it, the more I understood not so many. Yeah? So the idea of a divided Ukraine was it's now it's completely ridiculous, but also back then it was much less than even many journalists in the West believed. And unfortunately, we suffer a lot about the narratives from 2014. Now, maybe will speak a little bit more about that later, because many agents of influence and useful idiots who support the Kremlin's narrative, they use these talking points about the coup d'etat on Maidan, how they call it, and the civil war and things like that, which is, if you look deeper, not true at all. Yeah, we know that Russian citizens were responsible, were in charge. We know about the Russian soldiers on vacation. We know that a lot of radical groups came from Russia. So and MH17, it's now completely debunked, the Russian version, thanks to the Dutch, yeah, because the investigation was really good, but still we hear a lot of false claims about these events.
And of course, the news cycle moves on, and once you debunk something, people's attention has moved on. Well, we'll talk about the mechanics of that in a minute, because you mentioned sort of agents of influence there. And I think there's two angles here, isn't there? And both of these we can cover from current events that have happened in the last week. One is, how do you actually get inside people's brains to propagate these messages? And before we hit record, we were talking about a youth forum that is happening in St. Petersburg, the sort of shocking images of people from around the world actually coming to Russia to aggrandize what essentially is a totalitarian dictatorship, and to participate in a fantasy that it's not, that it's a democratic, progressive country. So that's how the narratives, part of how the narratives get implanted into people's brains and how you manufacture advocates. Then there's the expression of those narratives, and we've had another outburst over the weekend from the Pope. And this one perhaps is his worst yet. You know, he's said a number of things which are absolving, I would say, Russia of the sort of criminal actions that it performs, by saying, well, this is just a few, this is just Putin, and Russians are good people, and great Russian culture, and blah, 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 blah. We can deconstruct the narrative, but he's come out with these things. But this time he's gone far further by essentially telling Ukrainians that they need to consider surrendering, that they shouldn't be embarrassed about submitting the white flag and essentially giving themselves over to Russians. Now, people will be maybe outraged. This is morally reprehensible. But this opinion is informed by a number of disinformation narratives, isn't it? So how does this process work of planting and seeding narratives and then the expression of them in highly influential people?
It's very interesting because you mentioned two examples, and for me they are the most important at the moment during these days. Maybe in a couple of hours we will have something new. This isn't the nature of this phenomenon, unfortunately. But when we speak about the youth forum, it is very interesting. What is the target group here? And I observed this target group since many years. It's usually I would say old guys, yeah, the old peace, maybe Soviet, pro-Soviet influenced guys in the West, yeah, maybe what the Americans call tankies, or the far right, so some fascists who want to overthrow the European Union. These are the people that go to Russia and go to these conferences. In that case, it's different. It's about the youth. It's not something about diversity. Even they speak a lot about diversity there, which is ridiculous in the context of Russia and who Russia supports internationally, but especially in the European Union. But what they do, and what I also saw many years before even the full-scale invasion, that there is a certain scene of young people who want to go into diplomacy, who want to go into international events and want to participate, and we are all a big family. They don't really have any values, they don't really like the West, and they are very eager to cooperate even with authoritarian regimes. This I saw when they want to work for certain embassies. We have a lot of embassies and powerful embassies in Vienna because we have a lot of international organizations here, and you can always see, yeah, Myanmar, no problem. I would even go to North Korea. I just need an internship. And this is maybe one part of the target group, but in other cases, we saw that the people there, it's not a coincidence. For instance, party members from the pro-Russian party, I think Resurrection or something it's called, in Moldova, and from other parts of the world. We see a lot of participants from the BRICS Plus members, from Putin's allies, basically. And what happens there is it's quite shocking, because it's not only an event that is fake, that is whitewashing the Russian regime and paints it in another picture than reality is. it is also propagating the war. I saw one article from the forum itself where they explain the so-called special military operation, and they call it as an act of self-defense of the Russian Federation. I mean, can you imagine that? Yeah? So this is really absurd. And so this is very dangerous because generation Instagram, and I'm not talking about people in their 20s only, it's also people in their 30s, in their 40s. Yeah, Instagram is very diverse. But these people, they see it on social media, they see it in their reels, and I was not even looking for it recently. These kind of content, you see it all the time, and it is whitewashing Russia. It is also whitewashing, by the way, other regimes. It's not only a technique of the Russian government, also the Chinese use it, and many other countries that are allied in this coalition of anti-Western countries. And their narrative is, in most of these videos also, don't believe Western media. Now, I know that people like we also criticize Western media because they have a lot of pro-Russian talking points. But when they say don't trust Western media, it is, of course, meant in another way. When we speak about the Pope, this is exactly like you said. It's even worse than before. Yeah. Sometimes it seems like these people they want to get one level higher with every statement they make, or one level deeper. It's a matter of perspective. And what I find really interesting, did you know that Jeffrey Sachs was hired by the Pope for some academy thing? Yeah, there was even a press release about this. And I find this very interesting because Jeffrey Sachs is notorious well known for his I cannot call it differently than Russian narratives about Euromaidan, about the Western provocation, about NATO expansion, about yeah, that Ukraine should basically give up and give in to Russia.
That's right, and this brings several of the narratives together. I think we can sort of tick the box in 3 or 4 narratives that then underpin what the Pope says, what Jeffrey Sachs says, and I think it's important that you have advocates and advisors who are very much corrupted, but they're still able to keep their academic credentials and therefore get placements as advisors and so on. You also have others who are not necessarily agents or assets, or at least not that we can prove, but who do subscribe to some of these Kremlin talking points. And it's a sliding scale of extremism, but it all starts from the point of view that Russia is inevitable. Russia is invincible. You can't defeat it. It's big. It's great. It's blah, 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 you know. So you can go from that to, okay, resist it, but you'll never beat it. You go a little bit further down the spectrum, resist it, but it's pointless because they'll win in the end. And now you have the Pope, who is, I think, at the extreme end of that, which is advocating for the submission to evil. And maybe he's brainwashed into thinking that what Russia is doing is not evil because it intrinsically cannot be evil because it's Russia. It's intrinsically good. It's got, you know, family values, orthodox. It cannot be evil by its very nature. That plays into the civil war idea. If it's a civil war, then there's culpability on both sides. There's not an aggressor and a victim, which of course would be our interpretation of it. So this Pope's attitude here seems to bring together multiple disinformation narratives that Russia wants people to buy into.
Yeah, I find it very interesting that these kind of influencers, when we say influencers, at least in the German-speaking world, we think about Instagram, we think about social media. But before influencers were people who have influence, people like the Pope, people who have a certain kind of reputation. And when we discuss disinformation, even when we discuss foreign information manipulation, interference, FIMI, how the European Union calls it, then we often reduce the whole discourse to social media, bot farms, troll farms, and I really like to discuss that, but not today, and not as much as we do it by leaving out the important discussion about these agents of influence, useful idiots, or just people who have a certain reputation who spread disinformation and propaganda. And they are, in my opinion, much more dangerous because you mentioned media literacy, that I advocate for media literacy. Yes, to a certain extent, but unfortunately, media literacy does not protect us from agents of influence. If we teach it in the traditional way, it does not protect us from people who have a certain reputation in the academic sphere. I can give you a few examples without mentioning names because you can get easily sued in Austria, but we have several professors at our universities who have a history in the GDR, in the Socialist Party there, who studied in Moscow, who were socialized in Moscow, who are spreading Russian narratives, who have a very friendly relationship to President Lukashenko. Sorry, I have to correct myself because he is not president anymore. He was for sure not elected during the last election. So dictator Lukashenko. And these people, they write in our mainstream media. These people, they give interviews in public TV. And one of the most obvious example was the journalist Hubert Seipel in Germany, who appeared in German television, in Russian television, in Russian television as well, but in Austrian television. And he wrote a book about Putin, and he was very close to Putin, and he was spreading Russian narratives all the time. It was so obvious that something is going on very much. Even our journalists debunked him live on TV because they said, but Mr. Seipel, do you really believe? This is something that happens quite too seldom, and they are not very well prepared to debunk them. But you know, now we learned that he received at least 600,000 US dollar from oligarchs that are close to Putin, yeah, sponsoring for his book about Putin. And we assume that he received maybe more. We don't know for sure, but 600,000 extra and disclose access to Putin to sell more books, to make it more interesting. So this is quite a story, and we should critically reflect what happened, that we gave this person so much screen time, so much reputation, yeah? And we called him an expert, and even worse, we called him a journalist. And now tell me, how can media literacy protect me from such things? If you are in school or even in university, you in media literacy, you learn that trust journalists, trust media, trust established media, not social media. But Hubert Seipel was a so-called journalist. He was on public TV, the most trustworthy source that we have. So these agents of influence, they are really a huge problem because they have a lot of reach, they are internationally active, and people believe them. They call them experts, and you have a lot of them. And I don't want to argue who is paid and who not. First of all, we don't know it. This is the biggest problem, because you cannot even if you accuse them of being paid, they sue you. Yeah, not only in the German-speaking world, here even more than other world, but it would be very important to have detailed files, who is paid and who not. Because if we can prove that somebody is paid, this is the only way that his or her influence is ending. There are also a lot of women involved.
And it's tricky, isn't it? Because the US has laws around taking money from foreign powers, especially in order to influence foreign policy decisions. That has to be declared, and I believe it's a criminal offense if you don't do that. But it seems that this law is not always implemented consistently. And of course, you don't necessarily have to receive the money directly. There are many, many vehicles by which you can get enhanced reputation, book sales, and so on, it's almost a sort of indirect kind of benefit. Or you can win prizes, or prestigious trips to Russia, conferences and awards were a great way. Bursaries were, and that kind of thing, were a good way to help influence people. But then there are others, and we won't focus on the US system so much in this, but there is also the tendency for people to not necessarily get directly paid, but I'm thinking someone like Vivek Ramaswamy, who is part of or was one of the candidates for the presidential bid, coming out with openly Russian talking points, very detrimental to Ukraine. And we can't say that he's directly receiving money. There's no evidence of any of that at all. But he may well have made the calculation that his internal political status is increased by having I would say, a temporary alliance or even a permanent alliance with Russian talking points. And, that helps to amplify his profile. So that, I know, I'd be interested in your point of view there. That is also incredibly dangerous, isn't it? People who see self-interest, political self-interest, in aligning with Kremlin talking points.
Yeah, absolutely. Because if you are a competitor in an election campaign, it doesn't matter if in Europe or in the US or somewhere else even, and you have a pro-Russian stance, then you can bet on the Russian support, especially if it's a very close race and you are able to win or you are able to make a difference. And you can also be sure that Russia will not intervene against you. So, for instance, if you take a look at Germany, we know that the Greens are in particular targeted by Russian disinformation, Russian propaganda, hate speech. Baerbock is the big evil, and other parties are supported. And Medvedev even confirms this in one of his speeches, in one of his releases. And then we also need to understand that election campaigns and advertising is very expensive. So if the Russians help to amplify messages that are in favor of these candidates, this is worth a lot of money, and they don't even need to receive a dime directly. It's just about advertising costs. This is also what happened in 2016 in the US. We saw a lot of amplified messages, a lot of noise that was in favor of one of the candidates, and it was not Hillary Clinton.
If we talk about the antidotes to propaganda, because I think it's very important, isn't it, to do what you're doing, which is to tackle the narratives one by one, debunk them, provide evidence, provide sort of first-hand sort of witness accounts. That, however, doesn't always work for people who've fallen down a kind of informational rabbit hole. How important are things like connecting with reality, connecting with connecting with Ukrainians, for instance, or going to watch a film like 20 Days in Mariupol, which, again, very topical because it's just been announced that it's won the Oscar. But if you watch something like that, it's a brutal introduction to the reality of the Russian world. Do you think that can help to undercut some of the narratives, propaganda narratives?
Yes, I think it is very important to have an approach on many levels and then many different approaches. What I try to do at the moment is I'm the founder of the so-called Disinformation Resilience Network, which is a quite decentralized network and a possibility to come together and to have talks like we have now. Basically, it is all about that. It's to share information and to become smarter, to learn about more narratives, more agents of influence. And what we do is we also communicate decentralized. A journalist has a different approach than, for instance, a professor at a university. Then there are civil activists, there are people from diaspora clubs that we have also in Austria a lot of. We have the Ukrainians, we have also the Belarusians, who are, many of them are very active, opposition, of course. And what we try to do is to engage with the public, engage also with the stakeholders, and to create more people who are aware of the problem, to create more awareness, for instance, about agents of influence, about this whole phenomenon, how important it is, but also about the narratives itself. Because as much, if we can create more people who are basically capable of debunking the lies, then we are already much more powerful. As many people who work with disinformation say, it's very, very difficult to convince people who are very deep inside this conspiracy theory, alternative reality world. There it's going to be very hard. And what I also witnessed, and many people confirm they have the same experience, is in a face-to-face conversation, and I include social media in this. So if I react to a certain comment directly and I criticize a person for being wrong, it is very difficult to convince it, because there's always a reaction. Hey, don't attack me. I need to protect myself. I always believed in this. But if they see it somewhere else, if they listen to a certain podcast, I know many examples where people changed their minds and heard, okay, I heard something else. It was basically the Russians in 2014. And 20 Days in Mariupol is one example. In German TV, there was recently a documentary about a Wagner mercenary. And he told his story about all the illegal wars since the Soviet Union, the situation in Donbass, where he was as a Wagner soldier or mercenary already in 2014, about the war crimes, about the fake referendum, about the Russian involvement there. And he told it with his own words, and this was quite convincing. And I think if somebody sees that, that would be very discouraging to spread the Russian version of events anymore. So these are things, and we need to combine it, and we need a lot of effort. And unfortunately, we have, no, not unfortunately, but we are vulnerable as democracies because of freedom of speech, and we should keep it. I don't believe in censorship. But then civil society has a lot of work to do, and it cannot be limited to a few people, certain groups who tackle this. It needs to be a whole lot more efforts, yeah, from the government, from civil society, from education. And I don't see it at the moment. Not only in the German-speaking world, it's everywhere. It's not good enough, and it's not enough at all.
I sometimes see it, I compare it to an onion or even a sort of matryoshka doll of lies. And Russian disinformation would work on that level. You know, people who say, oh, I'm not convinced by a Russian disinformation because it's so obvious, it's so crude. Well, it's true that some of it is. And, you know, if you're able to have enough context or knowledge of current affairs or history to see the obvious propaganda, then that's great. You haven't seen all of it because there are layer upon layer upon layer upon layer of narratives. So even if you're not falling for one layer of narrative, you are probably falling for another, a deep one, which you're unaware of. Now, that might sound extremely paranoid. So let's give some examples here. I was at a conference in December talking to some political advisors in Paris, extremely influential and extremely pro-Ukrainian. They couldn't get behind the idea that Crimea is Ukrainian. They couldn't get behind the idea that it's not a purely Russian enclave, and that somehow returning it to Ukraine would not cause some sort of revolution or so on. So there's all sorts of ideas and projection of their own mindset, their own culture onto that, ignoring a number of historic details. One, Crimea voted 54% for independence. A lot of the native population, the Tatars, are going through, I think it's the umpteenth kind of wave of repression and being forced out of their country or made to disappear. But history says that you know, this entity, it's not as simple as they're all Russian and they should remain with Russia. But it seems that even people who are pro-Ukrainian, there's some level at which, you know, the complex reality starts to sort of distill down into some very simplistic propaganda tropes.
Yeah, thank you for mentioning this example. This is what I've witnessed a lot of times, and Also, you debunked it already. Yeah, you delivered already some of the arguments. I would also argue like that, so I don't need to repeat it anymore. If we would have this conversation later, or if we would refer to this, I would repeat it because it's very important that we also repeat our narratives much more often, because they do it with the disinformation. This is one mistake we should never make, to think something is already said. We need to say it over and over again in different words. Maybe some people will remember. But this, what you say about Crimea and especially about Donbass, is a big problem, that we see people who are even activists, pro-Ukrainian activists, I will call them, or people who are journalists who say, yeah, we need to condemn the Russian invasion, and there was a war that started in 2022. Then I say, no, it didn't start in 2022. It started in 2014. And this makes us so vulnerable. They are strong advocates, they wave Ukrainian flags, but it doesn't matter at all if they fail in this very, very important subject of what happened before. I totally respect if somebody says, sorry, I'm not so into politics. I didn't follow world politics a lot. And 2014, I knew that there was something with Crimea, blah, blah, blah. Okay, the same about Georgia, 2008. Many people were not aware at all that something is happening. But in 2024, we should make our homework about that, because when I watch talk shows on TV, then we see that these pro-Russian commentators, what they do, they say, yeah, Putin was reacting on NATO, then they get a lot of response by the other commentators. No, this doesn't justify, and NATO, it's not true, blah, blah, blah. But when they start saying that there was a war, a civil war for 8 years, and Russian speakers were suppressed, and the coup d'etat at Maidan, you know what kind of answer they receive a lot of time? This does not justify the full-scale invasion. This does not justify the invasion. But this is not the right answer. The right answer should be, come on, in 2014, Russian troops, hidden, so-called soldiers on vacation, entered Donbass. Artillery fire was coming from the territory, from Russian soil, and so on, and so on. So they did not get debunked, not even one single time. It's always that answer, except a few exceptions. And you can there are professors from our universities that are in roundtable discussions, and they said, we should not forget, in 2014, certain provinces of Ukraine wanted to be independent, but they got attacked by the Kiev regime. No reaction. And you have pro-Ukrainian people in the room, but they are just not capable of debunking it because they were not on board in this topic in 2014. It's a shame. It's really a shame.
And, you know, I've been to many events exactly as you described, some with people who've been labeled as, you know, Ukraine's most fierce advocates, and they'll come up, you know, they'll fudge their language, they'll say ambiguous things, which essentially gives cover, as you say here, to Russian disinformation. Another interesting one, and this is where, you know, a lot of the Russian disinformation isn't just out there. Well, some of it's out there to confuse us and prevent us from taking action. The nuclear terror threat one, of course, is a method of coercive control to prevent people like Schultz and others sending tourists. I mean, it's very, very clear, and it works on the Biden regime, unfortunately, as well. It's a form of a sort of bully threatening tactic. Also, there's one interesting one, and it's constantly in the media. Is Putin mad? Is his regime mad? Are they crazy, etc.? This also seems to me a narrative that is actually demonstrably put out by the regime, because if we think they're mad, we're going to self-manage our behaviors. We're going to think, hang on a second, we don't know what they're going to do. This is a dangerous situation. You know, we can't give Ukraine everything it needs because they're crazy and unstable. And I think that's another, you know, they don't mind making themselves look bad if it gives them an advantage in their objectives. And I think people fail to see the mechanisms behind it. But another interesting one, and a lot of these ladder up to a purpose, And one of those purposes is negotiation, legitimizing the concept of negotiation, even though we perhaps would suspect that negotiation is simply a tool for Moscow to pause the hostilities so they can regroup, rearm, and then try to salami slice Ukraine over again in 3 years' time, 5 years' time, 10 years' time, whenever it happens to be. It's part of a long-term strategy. But negotiation seems to be a key objective of a lot of the propaganda narratives. Would you agree with that? And can you see the mechanics of how that works, how they're trying to propagate that particular message?
Yeah, I totally agree with that. First, about the nuclear threat, I cannot make any predictions, especially if you analyze disinformation. I cannot make predictions about the future, what is going to happen. But what is obvious that this nuclear threat is part of the propaganda campaign and a part of to intimidate us and to make us helpless and to prevent us from helping and supporting Ukraine in a proper way. But this salami tactic, yeah, it is quite obvious, and for me it's a miracle how people cannot see it. I mean, the Russian regime, the officials of the Russian regime, the propagandists on state media, they communicate this completely openly. Firstly, they don't accept the independence of their neighbor. Secondly, they claim a lot of territories. And when you listen to many of the agents of influence, they say, no, it's only about the solution in Donbass and no NATO, everything is going to be fine. No, it's also about Zaporizhia, it's also about Kherson, as we know. And then when we listen to Medvedev, it's also about Odessa, it's also about Kharkiv, and the recent map that was published by Medvedev, yeah, is showing Kiev and the surroundings. It's a Ukraine that is only 10% or something from its original size. And we can hear it all the time. And even on that little Ukraine, they want to have a puppet regime. So basically, there is absolutely no way to think that there can be a fair kind of negotiation process or a result. Yeah. And we just need to listen to the Russians. We need to listen what the speaker of the Kremlin says, what Medvedev says, he's still part of the regime, what Putin says. But what they do is they communicate differently to Western actors than they communicate, for instance, to the global South, or how they communicate to their allies or to their domestic population. Yeah? The domestic audience, they have completely different messages. And what is one of the biggest problems that we have, not only since 2022, but since 2014, actually, is that we do not listen how and what they communicate to their domestic audience, because this hate speech and genocidal propaganda, it is really uncomparable only with the darkest times in the 20th century. Not even the Soviet Union had such ugly propaganda because they had to keep such standards, except from the Stalin era. So it is really very, very dirty what is happening on the domestic level. And if you see this, if you are aware of this, you cannot believe that there can be a negotiated solution with such a regime. And the second problem beside that is that we are unfortunately not talking enough about the occupation regime, how the people are living under occupation. I was, since the full-scale invasion, I was 2 times in Ukraine, and I met people who were in the torture chamber, political prisoners, journalists who were only able to flee because they were very lucky. And the situation is terrible. Everybody who is Ukrainian, who spoke Ukrainian at least sometimes, who has some Ukrainian flag at home or some tattoo that is connected to something that the Russians could consider fascist, because for them, what they call Nazism is basically only not obeying to Russia. Yeah? So the torture chambers, the deportation of kids, Then we have these Russification measures. They are burning Ukrainian books. So, I mean, do you want to negotiate with such people? It's quite ridiculous. But this is what the useful idiots and the agents of influence, they never mention this. They never mention two things: the Russian domestic propaganda and the situation in the occupation regime, because it just not serves their narrative.
And there are other problematic areas which we have to mention the word NATO, but let's put it into a context, I think, which is a little different than normally discussed. I mean, it's been my view right from the start of the full-scale war that Putin loathes NATO, not because he thought it was a threat. And there's multiple points of evidence we've discussed in various videos why this is the case. I mean, Russia's western border really not being fortified against NATO. It's the southern China border that was massively fortified. You put your troops and your artillery and you face them towards the threat. So evidence suggests that they didn't in reality believe NATO was a genuine military threat. And of course, we know that NATO has wound down its investment in heavy armor, howitzers, artillery units, sheer numbers of troops from the peak in the Cold War. We essentially disbanded our war machine, and Putin would have known that in detail. So that's a quick debunking of why NATO is not the main thing. But this particular narrative of NATO being a threat, it traditionally plays very well amongst the left wing, the tankies, as you've said. It is now, however, playing with the right wing quite well. And Trump has really been able to weaponize this one, creating narratives around, and unfortunately, based on some reality, that NATO members were not meeting their obligations to invest enough in defense. But there's a very interesting twist that propaganda gives this. It's not that you didn't meet an obligation, it actually turns into a debt, as if the US was making up for that, as if there's a bill somewhere, an unpaid bill, which is not the reality of how NATO works. I mean, sure, you might have to invest quite a lot to build your military back up. There isn't a physical IOU. American taxpayers have not had to pay for X, Y, and Z because they didn't pay. But this works incredibly well on the domestic scene. But this also works, I've noticed, in so-called neutral or non-aligned countries. And these countries also have either traditionally not had strong intelligence services, or they've wound them down to the point where they're relatively ineffective. Belgium is another example of that. There have been multiple stories about, Vienna being a hotbed of Russian assets and agents and spies and so on. I don't know what your view on that is. You tend to get quite a bit of animosity, and that plays very well with Russian propaganda in states that think of themselves as kind of neutral or non-aligned.
Yeah, I try to avoid to bore you with stories about Austria, because Austria is such a small country. But now you force me to say something, and you're welcome. Yeah, we have a specific situation in Austria. Many people ask me, what's the difference between Austria and Germany? Basically, we have the same talking points. What we don't have in Austria, fortunately, is we don't have a former GDR, because there the situation is extreme. But if you take our average population in every survey, Austria is more anti-Western, of course, more anti-NATO, much more than Germany. It's in the nature of the situation, and also more pro-Russian and anti-American. Yeah, sometimes there are slight differences. Sometimes it's quite obvious, but it doesn't matter if Eurobarometer, European Council Foreign Relations, whatever, name any survey organization, you will find these results. And what we have elections now. We have the European elections, and we have also the national elections for the new Austrian parliament. And we can see this anti-NATO rhetoric. It's not only by the far right, it's also by the center left. In Austria, it's not the far left, it's the center left, the Social Democrats who are spreading a lot of it. And NATO is, because we are not a member of it, it's demonized in Austria. There are more than 70 to 80% of Austrians who are against NATO. And I really applaud those who are against NATO and still say, but Ukraine had the choice to choose its alliance, even if it's not for us. Yeah, so it's not my opinion. Yeah, I think our status is quite problematic. Yeah. And when you have a situation where it is the kind of mainstream narrative that you call an alliance bad, that you demonize other parties that question maybe we should be part of, or maybe NATO is not so bad, in such situation, it is easy for Russia to say, we were afraid of NATO, because in Austria, it's common sense that NATO is something bad, something evil. So you also believe Putin when he says he was afraid of NATO. And I remember well that a few days before the full-scale invasion, there was already a lot of talk about the crisis, how it was called back then. And even journalists in public TV, they said, Putin is afraid of NATO. Russia is afraid of NATO. They did not say Russia claims to be afraid of NATO, which would be correct, only a slight difference, but a huge difference in the narrative. And the problem is Russia was never afraid of NATO, that NATO is going to invade it. The Kremlin was only afraid to be not able to invade anymore, to invade its neighbors, to have political power, to can use the military. Take a look at the Baltic countries. Yeah, it doesn't matter if Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, they are developing quite fine. They are good in technology. They are very good. The IT sector is excellent, and they have quite good economies. And this is what Russia wants to avoid with its other neighbors. Good example is also Poland, but Poland was not part of the Soviet Union, so it's a little bit different. So this NATO narrative and about Donald Trump, it's a matter of money. What he, I'm just back from a trip. I was in the US for a disinformation exchange program, and everything was organized. And we met people from the government and also from civil society. And what is common sense is that the Republican Party or the MAGA, especially the MAGA part of it, which is unfortunately in charge, they have a kind of they want to isolate the US. They don't want to spend a lot of money in Europe, and there's a lot of populism going on. And unfortunately, Russian narratives work there as well. It's a little bit of shame. Many people ask the question, what happened to Ronald Reagan's Republicans? And I asked one really very experienced former servant of the State Department, and he answered, well, unfortunately, many of them died already, or are super not active anymore, or became Democrats, even if it hurts themselves. Yeah, so it's a very difficult situation. It's unbelievable. And I have to add, I said a lot about we should not only focus on social media and internet and this super standard things that people discuss when they speak about disinformation or foreign interference. But the difference in that case is, of course, social media. I think MAGA could not work without a huge flood of disinformation on social media, without the Russian interference that would not be possible on that level without this technology.
And on that point on technology, and when we have to remember as well that radio, which was a relatively new technology in the 1930s, played a key role in the power of totalitarian regimes, whether that be in Central Europe, Russia, and so on. We can see the radio and telephones playing an extremely malign influence in, say, the novel Master and Margarita by Bulgakov. But radio and the rise of new technologies before people have developed the culture to be critical of information that comes from those technologies. I mean, that's maybe the topic for another discussion, but yeah, it's absolutely critical, isn't it? And I don't think we've developed the social machinery and the cultural machinery to be able to handle social media, which has developed in a very sophisticated way, very rapidly.
Yeah, it's a kind of two-sided coin, because I love social media in a certain way because we can use social media not only to debunk things that are happening on social media, but also that we can debunk things that are happening on mainstream media. And it's very interesting that when we have, as for instance, some talk shows with these Russian agents of influence, and we use Twitter to debunk them. We use Twitter to discuss them. And then other journalists say, oh, these people are quite right. I will dig a little bit deeper. Many journalists called me because of my posts on Twitter, and they said, I'm going to make an article. Can you give me your research about this? Can you tell me what is actually happening there? Can you give me your screenshots? Because I don't have the time. And of course, I like to provide it, even if it's not an official interview. I like to give background information. But then we have the other side. We have the troll farms, we have the bots, and we have all the content, the problematic content of the agents of influence that is on so-called mainstream media is also flooding social media, especially Instagram, but also Facebook. You see, and YouTube, you see these videos, you see these interviews, and sometimes they are even out of context. Yeah, you see such statements, and they serve authoritarian regimes a lot. And not only Russia, China, for instance, is very successful on YouTube, on Instagram. It's always the same narrative. We are more successful than the West. Don't trust Western media. Everything is a lie, what you hear there. And there are no human rights issues in China. It's quite simple. And what they sometimes also do is they support the Russian narrative. We have it with the so-called Chinesische Volkszeitung, which means Chinese people's paper, basically. And they claim that the Americans are to blame, that NATO is to blame for what is happening in Ukraine. And then they use this both sidism and false balance approach, but in the worst case, openly pro-Russian narratives. And this is also the next problem, that we have politicians, even good politicians, even the ones who are supporting Ukraine, and they say, we need to ask for more support from the global South and BRICS. They need to use their influence on Russia. No, it's not gonna happen because they are allied. Many of them are authoritarian regimes, are completely bought by Putin and receive the gas and oil. So this is completely ridiculous. They are not part of the solution. Unfortunately, they are part of the problem. We can just ask them, please, to stop, because in other case, we would also change our relationships towards them. So it's quite obvious.
Well, there's so many topics to follow up, I think, in a future conversation. I've been making notes here about the ones that would be great to dig into. I think BRICS and the international scene is another one, because it's very sort of problematic. But Dietmar, I agree, the work you're doing is absolutely essential. Your strong presence on Twitter and remaining on Twitter, I think, is incredibly important at this time. But for now, I wanted to thank you so much for sharing these insights with the audience. It's an incredibly important topic, and I look forward to collaborating on another episode in future.
Thanks for having me.